Hello, I'm Rabbi Elton from the Great Synagogue in Sydney, and welcome to From the Rabbi's Bookshelves. A good working definition of Rabbinic Judaism is a form of Judaism which regards the Talmud as authoritative, or at any rate as central to the practice of Jewish religious life. The Talmud is in fact a composite of two different literary achievements. The first is the Mishnah, which we discussed a few weeks ago. The Mishnah, to recap, is a record compiled and edited by Rabbi Judah the Prince in the year 200 CE of the oral traditions received by Moses on Mount Sinai that accompany the text of the Torah itself and which were handed down throughout the generations. In subsequent years, in cases 400 or 500 years, those traditions recorded in the Mishnah were further debated and discussed by the rabbis that followed. And that took place in two different locations. Rabbis in the land of Israel did so, and also rabbis in Babylon. The rabbis in the land of Israel created a work known as the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Talmud of the land of Israel, which is a very important work. But in terms of later tradition, even more important is the Talmud Bavli, the Talmud produced in Babylonia. Now, it's sometimes thought that this is a work in Aramaic. That's not entirely true. Although the discussions are in Aramaic, because that was the language used by Jews at the time, the quotations from the tradition are actually in Hebrew, at least in a form of Rabbinic Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew. And what the rabbis do in both the land of Israel and in Babylon is they take each line of the Mishnah and they analyze it. They bring other traditions, known as Braitot, of a similar age to the Mishnah but not included in the Mishnah, and they see which are authoritative, whether the Mishnah gives the final ruling or not. And they also will investigate such questions as whether a particular law is biblical in its authority or rabbinic. They look at which verse is the source of a particular commandments, and they try and decide of the many competing traditions which is the closest to the authentic and which is to be applied in practice. The Talmud comes in many, many volumes and many editions. The most famous edition is the Vilna Shas, and here is one of my copies of the Vilna Shas, and this comes from an edition which can fit easily on a tabletop, on a desktop, for somebody who's learning and wants to compare the text in front of them to other texts in the Talmud. Let's have a look at a typical page of the Talmud. In the middle, in this Vilna edition, you have the text of the Mishnah, first of all, and then the Gemara underneath, those rabbinic discussions on the Mishnah that took place in the academies of Babylon until about the year 600 when it was finally edited. And then always on the inside of the page, you have Rashi, Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac, who was active in northern France in the 11th century. He writes a commentary on every single line or word of the Talmud, which he regards as difficult to understand in some way. On the other side, you have the comments of his grandchildren and their contemporaries. They're called the Balei Tosafot, those who make additions. And what they do is something rather different. They compare the text in front of them with other texts around the Talmud and try and reconcile all of those. So the traditional way to learn a page of Talmud is to learn the Mishnah and the Gemara, and then Rashi and then Tosafot, and that is merely the commentaries which appear on the page themselves. In the back of each Talmud, there are more commentaries and many, many other volumes. But the meat and potatoes, as it were, of Talmudic study, which is a staple in the yeshivot and the academies which are still active today, is the page of Talmud. And of course, there is a tradition now of learning a page of Talmud every day, both the front of the page and the back of the page, and that way you can complete the entire Babylonian Talmud in 7.5 years. Thanks for joining.